Welcome, everyone, to session two. We are now in Joshua chapter 6, God conquering his enemies. Of course, this is the Battle of Jericho. But in the new title here, I think it's important for us to draw attention that this story has, in many ways, shared parallels with what happened when the Lord defeated Egypt, of course, with his servant Moses, as the leader of the people. So, like the Egyptians before them, Yahweh destroys the enemies of his people. In this case, it's Jericho, but of course, every other city and its king will fall like dominoes in like sequence, though the battle itself may be very different. So, I've structured this like the last session, echoes of familiar stories, moving into Joshua 6, verse 2, where the Lord says he's handed Jericho, its king, and its soldiers over to them. Now, notice this when he says he's done this, he's essentially saying, I have subdued them under you, which in many ways goes all the way back to the actual Genesis creation story. Now, if you've heard me say this before, let me just reiterate it now that in many ways, the story of Genesis and Genesis chapters 1 through 12, for that matter of fact, is more or less like a microcosm that helps us understand how many of these other longer story sequences are framed out. And so, with that, what we have is God handing over everything, placing all of the earth under Adam's rule, literally everything that flies in the air, crawls on the earth, or swims in the sea. And if he's put it under the headship of Adam, Adam ultimately is to be seen as king. Well, even though Joshua never wears a crown as king, yet what God is promising here is that he is handing over this city and its king, and every king like the king of Jericho, and every other city, no matter how big it might be, in the land of Canaan, will be like Jericho and handed over to Joshua. So essentially, Joshua is not only filling the shoes of Moses, but as Moses filled the shoes of Abraham, who filled the shoes of Noah, who filled the shoes of Adam, they're all seen against that great backdrop. So here, Joshua is, in a sense, kind of like a new Adam. And then, of course, it's not a coincidence at all when we look in the next verse where the Lord, as he's laying out the battle plan, tells them to march around the city for 6 days. None of this had to happen. Clearly, it didn't have to happen. If God wanted to, he could have told them to circle the city immediately, raise their voices, start shouting, blowing their shofar horns, and the walls would have crumbled right then. There was no need for this show. God could have done anything he wanted to in the amount of time he wanted to. Obviously, this was an act of faith and testing for these Israelites and the members of the army, but not just the army, of course, the priests and Levites that were involved in carrying the ark around the city each and every day. So for 6 days, they were to march around the city. We go back to Exodus chapter 20 with the Ten Commandments, only because this particular statement is very concise without having to go through all the different verses in Genesis chapter 1. But Moses wraps up all of the events of Genesis 1 by saying, The Lord made the heavens and the earth and the sea in 6 total days. So this sequence here in Joshua chapter 6 is supposed to harken back to the moment of creation. Now, before you perhaps may accuse me politely of saying, well, it seems like you're just kind of hyperlinking that because both of those stories of Genesis 1, its recap in Exodus 20, and then Joshua 6 are using the phrase 6 days, but I'm not really sure I see the connection. Well, again, it's important for us to appreciate how the events of Genesis chapters 1 through 3, again, a microcosm of what God is doing in later story sequences. Because after the Tower of Babel and then its judgment, when God disperses the nations, now it seems like all the nations have just walked away from Yahweh. How is he going to fill the earth with his glory as he intended to do through the first image bearers if everyone has just decided to walk away from Yahweh and they can't understand each other and they didn't really have the solidarity of mind or heart to really worship God in sincerity and truth? Humanity is yet walking the path of the pre-flood or antediluvian humans, in spite of what God had done through Noah and his family. Well, then right after that, he brings Abraham and he says, I will make you great. I will multiply you. I will bring kings from your lineage. So he's using all the same terminology as we went over in the first quarter, comparing those parts of Genesis together, using the same terminology to help make sure that we, as the readers, understand that God did not abandon this experiment. He's not doing something new. He's doing it through different people. And so now, as they have walked through the River Jordan, basically repeating the events of what happened with the crossing of the Red Sea. Um, then we are to appreciate that moment of crossing the Red Sea as entering into a new creation. Their land of exile and death is behind them. God has completely severed their connection to it. And now their days of wilderness wandering is over. They are entering in the land of their rest, their Sabbath rest, which is actually our next point. So on the seventh day, march around it 7 times, just like when God caps off creation, having already finished it at the end of the sixth day. But the seventh day brings the completeness to creation, and he rests that day and then takes the man he's made, brings him into the garden, and invites him into that Sabbath rest. So, granted, it doesn't sound like there's a lot of rest here when these people have to literally climb over the rubble heap of fallen walls, go in and, in a very bloody, heinous way, put everyone that's running through the city in complete chaos to death. But nonetheless, this is the rest because in doing so, God has delivered them into their hands. And then by virtue of that, all they have to do is just sit back, take up the spoils, and trust that God is going to lead them into ultimate victory, which of course he does. Do not shout, do not let your voice be heard. That's what Joshua tells any of them. Complete silence. This also goes back to the moment when they're crossing the Red Sea, right? Because as they're all crying out to Moses, he tells them, look, stand still, be quiet. You will see the Lord's salvation. He will fight for you. So I think there's a strong point of connection there for us to appreciate the fact that yet again, as God delivers the Egyptians into their hands without them having to raise a sword, even though they will raise a sword here, he's already promised to deliver Jericho and its occupants over to them. On the seventh day, they started at dawn. Why? Well, because maybe it's going to get hotter as the day goes on. Sure, that's perhaps a practical point of looking at it. But again, if there's already a point of connection with the Red Sea crossing, here's another, because it was at the turn of the night into the morning that the Lord threw the Egyptian forces into confusion and ultimately brought about their destruction. And this, of course, goes back to the moment of creation when all of creation is shrouded in darkness, and the first thing that Yahweh speaks is, "Let there be light," bringing order to the chaos to be further ordered after this, sure. But the idea, of course, is that God is bringing order to the chaos. We have a tightly walled up, defensed city that is probably impregnable by these Israelites who are only on foot, have no cavalry, no chariots, no siege towers. They really don't have very good means of conquering the city unless they can find a way to breach it. And yet God brings the walls down so that all they have to do is run over those walls and enter the city. And everyone is completely thrown into total confusion because now there's nowhere to run to, no safety to be found anywhere. And the troops advanced into the city and they captured the city, right? Just like the Israelites walked through dry ground and the Lord saved Israel. So as he parted the unnegotiable obstacle of the Red Sea in front of them, they can't scale these walls, but yet God brings them down. And of course, as God rested on the seventh day from his work, because he completed it all, so Israel now is resting on this Sabbath feast of their dead enemies lying in front of them as they've now entered into their inheritance that God has staked his banner into the ground on and says, "This is my land and I'm sharing it with you. Trust me and I will lead you to ultimate victory." So I hope that was helpful. And I look forward to sharing this a little bit more in depth with you when we get to our 30-minute breakdown at the workshop. Thanks for listening. Tune in to our next session.